There's a quiet moment most people know all too well. Everything is clear. The next step is obvious. The plan makes sense. And still, nothing moves. The body stays where it is. The hand doesn't reach. The decision gets pushed to later, not because of confusion, not because of lack of information, but because something inside tightens the brakes at the exact moment clarity arrives. That's usually where the story turns harsh. Labels come fast, lazy, undisciplined, unmotivated, as if knowing what to do should automatically flip some internal switch and produce action on command. But anyone who's been there knows it doesn't work like that. If it did, gyms would be full year-round. Unfinished projects wouldn't pile up, and late-night promises to start tomorrow wouldn't feel so familiar. What's rarely said is this: that stuck feeling isn't random, and it's not a personal flaw. It's patterned, predictable, almost intelligent in the way it shows up. Like a traffic light that stays red, not because it's broken, but because something unseen decided it wasn't safe to cross yet. And until that reason is understood, no amount of honking changes the signal. So instead of asking why people don't act, a more honest question emerges. What exactly is happening in that gap between knowing and doing? What's being protected? What's being avoided? And why does the mind, of all things, seem to work against what it consciously wants? That's the space this conversation steps into. Not with pressure, not with slogans, but with a slower look at what's actually pulling the strings underneath the surface. Because once that hidden logic becomes visible, the struggle starts to make sense. And when something makes sense, it doesn't need to hold so tight anymore. There's a kind of frustration that shows up when nothing is unclear. The next step is obvious. The decision has already been made, at least rationally. And still, nothing happens. The body doesn't follow. The action doesn't come. Not because of doubt, but despite certainty. Most people don't talk about this because it doesn't fit the usual explanations. When someone doesn't know what to do, it makes sense to pause. But when someone knows exactly what to do and still doesn't move, the situation feels harder to justify. That's usually where self-judgment enters. The assumption becomes simple. Something must be wrong with the person, so the mind reaches for familiar labels. Lazy, undisciplined, not motivated enough, as if action were a switch that flips automatically once clarity appears. But real life keeps contradicting that idea. People delay important conversations they care deeply about. They avoid changes they've thought through for years. They stay stuck not because they don't understand the cost, but because understanding alone doesn't create movement. What's striking is that this paralysis often appears around things that actually matter. Career decisions, personal projects, boundaries in relationships. The more weight a choice carries, the more resistance seems to show up. If it were simple indifference, action wouldn't feel so tense. The tension itself is a clue that something deeper is happening. At that point, forcing motivation rarely works. Trying to shame oneself into action usually backfires. The system tightens instead of loosening. Effort increases, but movement doesn't. It starts to feel like pushing against something invisible. Not external, but internal. And that's where the usual explanation falls apart. Because this isn't about not wanting something badly enough. It's about an internal conflict that hasn't been understood yet. And the reason this conflict exists is not what most people think. Most people grow up believing the mind works as a single unit. One intention, one decision, one direction. But real experience quickly shows something else. A person can want something and resist it at the same time. They can plan carefully and still sabotage the execution, not because they're inconsistent, but because different parts are pulling in different directions. It's less like a straight line, and more like a tug of war. One side is focused on goals, outcomes, improvement. The other is concerned with safety, stability, and avoiding disruption. When both pull with equal force, movement stalls. From the outside, it looks like inaction. From the inside, it feels like effort without progress. This explains why telling yourself to just do it rarely works. That command speaks to only one part of the system. Another part hears it as a threat, not a challenge to overcome, but a risk to manage. And when risk is detected, resistance isn't a flaw, it's a function. The mind doesn't block action randomly. It negotiates. It weighs consequences that aren't always conscious. That's why someone can feel drained after doing nothing. Energy was spent managing internal friction, even if no visible step was taken. What most people miss is this. The part that resists action isn't broken, weak, or irrational. It has a purpose. And in many cases, it's the part that believes it's winning, by keeping things exactly where they are. When action doesn't happen, it's easy to assume nothing is gained. But internally, something often is. Staying still can quietly solve a problem. It prevents exposure, no risk of failing, no chance of being judged, no need to face uncertainty head-on. In that sense, not acting isn't neutral. It's protective. Think about work decisions that get delayed for months. Sending a proposal, asking for a raise, applying for a position that would stretch your abilities. On the surface, it looks like procrastination, but underneath, staying where you are avoids a possible outcome. Your system isn't ready to process yet. Rejection, visibility, responsibility, all postponed by inaction. The same pattern shows up in relationships. Conversations that need to happen don't. Boundaries remain unspoken. Endings are delayed. Not because the person doesn't know what they feel, but because acting would force an emotional shift that feels heavier than the current discomfort. So the familiar situation stays in place. Even when it's unsatisfying, this is why self-criticism misses the point. The system isn't failing. It's choosing the option that minimizes immediate emotional cost. That choice might create long-term stagnation, but in the short term, it reduces exposure. From that perspective, the block makes sense. Once this is seen clearly, blame starts to lose its grip. The question changes. Instead of, why can't I move? It becomes, what is being protected by staying still? And that leads to an important realization. The reason this protection works so well is because the mind is wired to prefer something very specific. Not happiness, not growth, but what feels manageable right now. The mind doesn't choose between pain and comfort. It chooses between familiar and unfamiliar. That distinction explains a lot of behavior that otherwise seems irrational. A known discomfort can feel easier to carry than an uncertain outcome, even when the unknown has the potential to be better. That's why people stay in routines they openly dislike. A job that drains energy, a relationship that no longer fits, a daily rhythm that feels limiting. None of this is hidden from awareness. What keeps it in place is predictability. The discomfort is already mapped. The emotional cost is known. There are no surprises. The unknown, on the other hand, demands adaptation. It asks the system to update its expectations, its self-image, and its coping strategies all at once. That's expensive, not in effort, but in emotional processing. So the system defaults to what it already knows how to survive. This is also why patterns repeat even after insight. Understanding a pattern doesn't immediately rewire the preference for familiarity. Someone can recognize a dynamic is unhealthy and still feel pulled toward it. The pull isn't toward pain itself, but toward what doesn't require recalibration. Seen this way, repetition isn't stubbornness, it's efficiency. The system is conserving energy by sticking with what's already organized internally. Change demands reorganization, and reorganization always feels risky at first. But sometimes, the resistance isn't just about fear of the unknown. Sometimes it's tied to something even more fundamental, the image of who you believe yourself to be. Every action we take confirms a story about who we are, and every action we avoid protects that story from being challenged. That's why change often feels less like a logistical problem and more like an identity threat. Doing something new isn't just about effort. It quietly asks, if I act this way, who am I becoming? Most people carry older roles longer than they realize. The responsible one, the one who doesn't take risks, the one who keeps the peace, the one who always struggles. These identities form early, often as solutions to past situations. They work, until they don't. But even when they stop serving us, they still regulate behavior. This is why insight alone doesn't dissolve resistance. A person can want growth, freedom, success, and still feel a tightening inside when action would contradict the old role. The system reads that contradiction as danger, not physical danger, but existential instability. Something familiar would be lost. That's also why forcing discipline can make things worse. Discipline applied against identity feels like self-betrayal. The more someone tries to override the old role through pressure, the more the system pushes back, not because it's weak, but because it's trying to maintain coherence. Until the identity itself is questioned and updated, action remains costly. The system isn't resisting change. It's defending continuity, and that defense explains why willpower often collapses exactly where motivation is strongest. Discipline is often treated like a universal solution. If something isn't happening, the answer seems obvious. Push harder, set stricter rules, remove excuses. But discipline only works when the system feels safe enough to comply. When fear is involved, pressure doesn't motivate. It alarms. The body reacts faster than logic. Long before a conscious thought forms, the system remembers past experiences associated with exposure, failure, or emotional overwhelm. So when action points in that direction, tension rises automatically, muscles tighten, breathing shifts, focus narrows. This isn't resistance by choice, it's anticipation. That's why forcing discipline can feel like dragging yourself towards something your body is actively bracing against. From the outside, it looks like lack of commitment. From the inside, it feels like walking into emotional pain with no protection. The system doesn't need more commands in that moment. It needs reassurance. This also explains the cycle many people fall into. They push hard for a short period, override the signals, then collapse. Motivation disappears. Fatigue sets in. The conclusion becomes personal again. I never follow through. But what actually happened is that fear was ignored, not resolved. Discipline fails here not because it's useless, but because it's being applied at the wrong layer. When fear is active, control strategies create more friction, not movement. And what the mind is really avoiding in those moments isn't action itself. It's something that comes with the action. Something emotional that hasn't been named yet. When people say they're procrastinating, they usually focus on the task, the email, the decision, the first step. But tasks don't carry weight on their own. What actually creates resistance is the emotional state that comes with doing them. The system isn't avoiding action. It's avoiding what it expects to feel once action begins. That feeling varies, but the pattern is consistent. It can be anxiety before exposure, shame before being seen, grief before letting go of an old version of life. Even excitement can trigger resistance if it threatens stability. The mind doesn't differentiate between good and bad emotions here. It differentiates between manageable and overwhelming. This is why distraction works so well. Scrolling, cleaning, organizing, planning. All of it creates movement without emotional contact. The body stays busy while the core feeling remains untouched. From the outside, it looks like avoidance. Internally, it's regulation. Once this is understood, the behavior stops looking irrational. Of course, the system delays if action would open a floodgate. It doesn't know how to close. Avoidance becomes a way of keeping emotional intensity within tolerable limits. This also explains why advice focused on productivity often misses the mark. Tools don't address feelings. Schedules don't soothe fear. When emotional avoidance is the driver, efficiency strategies feel strangely ineffective. And sometimes, the confusion goes even deeper. Because even the thing you say you want might not be the force actually guiding your behavior. Desire is often treated as the engine of action. If you want something badly enough, you'll move toward it. That's the story we're told. But real behavior doesn't follow desire alone. Many people want change, success, freedom, and still freeze when they get close. Not because the desire is weak, but because something else is louder. What often moves behavior isn't what we want, but what we're trying to secure. Approval, recognition, relief from self-doubt, a sense of worth that feels conditional. When action is tied to these hidden demands, it becomes loaded. Success stops being just success. It becomes a verdict. Failure stops being feedback. It becomes confirmation of a fear. This is why people stall right before things start working. The project is almost ready. The relationship is improving. The opportunity is real. And suddenly, energy drops. Doubts multiply. The system senses that crossing this threshold would force a confrontation with expectations it's not prepared to meet. In those moments, desire isn't absent, it's overridden. The system prioritizes emotional safety over forward motion. Staying just short of the goal keeps hope alive without demanding a final answer. It's an uncomfortable balance, but a familiar one. Understanding this shifts the question again. The issue isn't a lack of wanting. It's that wanting has been mixed with pressure, identity, and imagined consequences. And until those forces are untangled, effort keeps turning into hesitation. So the real question becomes simpler and harder at the same time. How do you move when so many internal forces are pulling you back? When internal resistance is misunderstood, the instinct is to fight it, push through, override it, silence it. But fighting a part of the system only strengthens the split. One side escalates effort, the other escalates defense. The result is exhaustion without progress. Real movement begins when the war stops, not when resistance disappears, but when it's listened to. The part that slows things down isn't the enemy. It's responding to something it perceives as a risk. Integration doesn't mean obeying fear. It means understanding what fear is trying to prevent. This requires a different posture, less command, more curiosity. Instead of asking, "How do I force myself to act?" the question shifts to, "What does this part need in order to feel safe enough to move?" That single shift lowers internal tension. When parts of the system are acknowledged, they stop shouting. The energy that was spent on internal control becomes available for action. Movement feels less dramatic, less heroic, and more natural. It happens in smaller steps, but with far less resistance. This is why sustainable change often feels quiet. Not because nothing is happening, but because nothing is being fought anymore. The system reorganizes itself when it's no longer under threat, and that understanding leads to a very practical shift in how action is approached. Once everything is seen more clearly, the problem changes shape. It's no longer about fixing yourself or becoming someone more disciplined. It becomes about naming what's actually happening. Fear loses intensity when it's identified. Protection relaxes when it's acknowledged instead of attacked. At this point, something important happens. The system no longer needs to block action so aggressively, not because the risk disappeared, but because it's no longer ignored. When a feeling is brought into awareness, it stops needing to control behavior from the background. This doesn't require big moves. In fact, small conscious steps work better. Action taken with awareness feels different from action taken under pressure. It carries less weight. It doesn't demand a full identity shift all at once. It simply tests reality, gently. What matters here is honesty. Admitting, "Part of me is afraid," without turning that into a flaw. Recognizing that hesitation once served a purpose, even if it no longer does. That recognition alone softens the grip of avoidance. Movement returns not as a command, but as a response. And in that moment, something subtle but powerful becomes clear. The moment you understand what's holding you, it no longer needs to.